Warning: if you can't handle the truth, do not proceed to watch this legendary lecture any further. This presentation by Professor Zak Kondo contains information that could literally make your head explode, especially if you've been fed lies all your life about the assassination of Malcolm X. Don't say you weren't warned.
Back, so at the end of the lecture you can make purchases, and within reasonable time we get him to autograph a couple. He's still in the fluxus to decide what he'll do after the program, but that's neither here nor there. He wants me to tell you that he's a father of 5, and he acknowledges very quietly that he teaches at Bowie State University in Maryland. Sisters and brothers, a true African revolutionary in the tradition of all those ancestors who've gone before us and yet to come. Let's welcome our brother, Zak Kondo.
Asante Sana. As is tradition in some African cultures, I need when a younger speaks, he needs the permission of an elder, preferably the oldest elder in the room. I'm not real sure who that might be, although I think Baba Shinda certainly would be in the running. You've given me permission? Sure. Thank you, Baba. Now, I am very honored to be here. I'm also really impressed by the energy in this room, by the organization, by the politics of the organization. Feel very, very comfortable being here. I was also impressed earlier before the program started, because I was sitting down talking to 2 young brothers. I think one's about 27, Brother Patrick. I'm not sure where he is right now. Right here. Okay, brother. And then I was talking to another brother, said he was in the 9th grade, this brother right here. And he was asking me some questions about some challenges that they're having, in high school. And at first I just assumed, he was probably in college. But the level of consciousness for a 9th grader, was, I just kind of got pumped up, just from that. So, Newark is obviously, doing some progressive things, certainly things that our people, are in desperate need of. Now, I was thinking about how I wanted to begin this presentation, and I decided I didn't want to jump directly into Malcolm. The Bible was mentioning, this whole thing yesterday that happened with Clinton ordering a strike in Iraq, and I thought I wanted to say something about that. I spent the day yesterday, with my family. Oh, by the way, one of the things that I didn't say, I said I was a father of 5, is that I'm also, married to Mama Nia Kondo. But I spent yesterday with my family, and didn't really read the newspaper or listen to the radio or the news or anything like that. So when I got up this morning in order to catch my train, I was a little bit surprised when the headline this strike. And I think what interests me the most, though, was the reasoning that they gave for the strike. Their reasoning was that they had uncovered all of this evidence that Iraq tried to assassinate Bush when he was overseas. And of course we read that a few months ago. But this is what intrigues me. Having studied the enemy's intelligence apparatus, and especially the extent to which the enemy basically feeds off of assassination, it was intriguing to me that here's an enemy now. Here's an enemy that has participated in, as we used to say, you know, in the 70s. I don't think they say it that much no more. The young people, be creating words every year and stuff. But here's an enemy that has participated in beaucoup assassinations of foreign leaders. You can begin anywhere you want, but just a few would probably be 1954. You could go to Panama, President Ramos. Of course, they tried to kill Castro, I don't know, about 30 times. Failed each time. Then, of course, Patrice Lumumba in, January 1961. Then, of course, Tutelia of the Dominican Republic in May 1961. And then Diem of South Vietnam, the fall 1963. General Snyder in Chile, 1970. But imagine the thought pattern there. In other words, it's okay for me to kill the foreign leaders of other countries. But if somebody tries, and remember now, they did not say that an attempt was made on Bush. They said it was a plot. Now let somebody plot a punk who, when he was CIA director, for that 1 year, was also involved in assassinations. I mean, imagine that mentality. Now, the reason that I bring it up is that that is the same mentality that we got to address when we talk about Malcolm's assassination, when we talk about King's assassination. But I don't know if, and I don't say that this is all that bad, because I guess we can win, when the enemy also does it, to their own, if you get my drift. And I'm specifically thinking about people like the Kennedy boys, for example, because one of the things that we know very little of is the extent to which the Kennedys, particularly John F. Kennedy, was sleeping with organized crime. He was sleeping with the intelligence community. In other words, it still amazes me, and that's why I said something about this the other day, and I think I mentioned it to some degree on Gil's program. It amazes me the extent to which our people got upset when John F. Kennedy took it, without realizing, here's a man, and his father, by the way, just for the record, his father built an empire using two things, bootlegging and the stock market. And not only that, but his father was on a personal relationship with many of the most powerful mafia bosses and underbosses. In fact, he was so tight with them that on at least 2 different occasions, there were hits made on his head because he was double-crossing people and stuff. And of course, the ultimate hit, actually resulted in part, in the assassination of his own son, because the Kennedys were making deals, and they were telling people like Sam Giancana of Chicago, and Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, and Johnny Rosselli of the West Coast, and Santo Travacanti in Miami, they were telling them things like, if you help to elect my boy Jack, his administration is going to be, a very friendly, in fact, it's going to be the most friendly administration that organized crime has ever had. Give us your support. Elect Jack, and I guarantee you his administration will be looking the other way. And of course, this is also the same person who basically did nothing. And we need to underline that, nothing as far as African people are concerned. But of course, we cried crocodile tears. Not to mention the fact, this is also a man who, even though they spent the last 2 decades denying it and, et cetera, this is also a man who was on the inside track of the Castro assassination plots. Yeah, he knew about them. In fact, his brother Bobby knew about it too. They didn't necessarily authorize it per se. It started under the Eisenhower administration, but they knew what was going on. So anyway, I'm kind of beating around the bush to some degree, but the point is that the mentality, you know, that sickening mentality, that arrogant mentality is alive, you know, and it's well. And I suspect that before Clinton, you know, runs his course, we're probably going to see it time and time again. And I think that, you know, we certainly need to begin to prepare for that. Now, having said all of that, let me now jump into Malcolm X, and specifically Malcolm's assassination. Let me begin by saying, however, that the Malcolm assassination is a very ugly story. It's a very disheartening story. It's a sickening story. And people ask me, you know, why did it take me 11 years, you know, to write the book? One of the reasons is that I had to put the book, you know, I had to, you know, put the research down from time to time because of, you know, what I was coming up with. And, you know, we made a lot of mistakes in Malcolm's assassination. And when I say we, I mean we as African peoples. And we don't have no saints in this story. We don't have nobody, you know, basically, you know, walking around, you know, with their chests out. We made a lot of mistakes in the Malcolm X assassination. And I guess one of the tragedies today still is that we made a lot of mistakes, and yet we still got people here who want to tiptoe around it. We still got people who want to play a lot of games. We still got people who want to avoid the truth, you know, with all, you know, at all costs, using, you know, any means necessary, and that therefore prolongs, you know, the healing. You know, the community, our community is not healed. We still have different camps in our community, and our community will not be healed until we start dealing with the truth. And I think the irony of ironies, and, you know, we were having a conversation earlier today, which I think kind of ties right into that when I was talking to the young brother. And that is, the irony of ironies, though, is that some of the same people who will spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours in their lectures talking about the truth, and we got to deal with the truth even when it hurts, the truth, the truth, the truth. People don't like me speaking the truth, the truth. Same people that be saying that in their lectures for 2 and 3 hours are then some of the same people who are running away when it comes to dealing with truth that involves them, that involves their organizations. And at some stage, we got to stop playing these silly games. Now, where do we want to begin with the Malcolm X assassination? Well, first off, let's identify the people who got blood on their hands. First and foremost, of course, we got to deal with the Nation of Islam. In fact, you know, I guess it's, you know, it's kind of, I don't know if the word is appropriate or not, but, you know, the killers of Malcolm came out of Newark, came out of Mosque number 25. Yeah, all, in fact, at least one of the killers still lives in the area, even though I've been told probably 2 actually do. Haven't done now day in either our courts or in the enemy's courts. You know, can walk around and could possibly even be here today. Imagine that. You know, here you take out a man, and you know, don't even have to worry, don't even have to look over your shoulders after almost 30 years. I mean, I think that's, you know, a pretty disgusting, you know, situation that we find ourselves in. At any rate, let me deal first with the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was used in Malcolm's assassination. And this is how they were used. The enemy studied the Nation of Islam very well. You know, they had infiltrated it. They bugged offices. And they pretty much knew what was going on. And the way the thing went down was, all the enemy had to do, for the most part, was once events evolved that eventually led to Malcolm first being suspended from the nation, and then basically being ousted from the nation. Because, you know, people like to tiptoe around that. You know, they say Malcolm quit, Malcolm quit. Well, you know, Malcolm quit, you know, I think you could probably say that, you know, depending on how you define the word quit. But the truth of the matter is that Malcolm was not allowed to stay. You know, his suspension reached a point in which it was indefinite. And he probably, you know, it would have been the next 12 years had he just not basically said, okay, you know, it's time to make my move. But at any rate, the enemy had studied the Nation of Islam well enough to know that once events unfolded and Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad was at odds, because remember now, what was the key? First to Malcolm's ousting. I think this is what I want to do. First, I want to deal with Malcolm's ousting. Then I want to deal with the interim period once Malcolm was out, and then finally the assassination, to kind of, you know, put that in context. Because I decided I wanted to be very informal today. Usually, you know, I would bring in a few notes, and I decided I didn't even want to make no notes because I feel very much at home. Yeah, you know, so I'm in one of my classrooms, you know, talking to my brothers and sisters, and I look forward to a good exchange of information, you know, after this. This was the Bureau's game plan. It was a simple game plan, too. In fact, you know what? It was too damn simple. Here you got an organization, Nation of Islam, an apolitical organization. A lot of times we forget that, but it was an apolitical organization as far as the community, for the most part, was concerned. Had a whole lot of potential, though. Even had its own paramilitary wing. Unfortunately, however, the paramilitary wing, you know, never dealt with the enemy, though. It only dealt with us. You know, that's one of the great tragedies of the Nation of Islam, you know, is that they never went after the enemy, but you could always count on them to go after one of us. At any rate, Malcolm was cool inside the Nation of Islam so long as he had the backing of Elijah Muhammad. And you know, theirs was a love relationship. Elijah Muhammad appreciated Malcolm's youth, Malcolm's energy, Malcolm's diligence, Malcolm's commitment. Malcolm basically being a doer. When he had an ideal, he dropped it in Malcolm's lap, and Malcolm did the rest. And he appreciated that. Malcolm, on the other hand, appreciated Elijah Muhammad's wisdom, his experiences, his spirituality, his support. And they basically fed off of each other. Now, very early on, though, there was envy. And Malcolm felt, he felt a lot of that envy. There were those ministers, members of Elijah Muhammad's family, etc., who were jealous of Malcolm, who thought that Malcolm was getting too much play because it was the media focusing on him, not on Elijah Muhammad, or in some instances, not on that person who was envious of Malcolm. So that bothered them. Some were also bothered that, Elijah Muhammad, was off and on sick, and it was no secret that sooner or later, he was going to join the ancestry. And therefore, some were bothered on what would happen once the old man dies. Is Malcolm going to take over? And of course, this was especially the concern of Elijah Muhammad's family. They, of course, wanted, because remember, at Malcolm's suggestion, Elijah Muhammad began to fill many of the national leadership positions with his own family. Raymond Sharif, his son-in-law, was the supreme captain of the Fruit of Islam. Elijah Muhammad Jr., his son, was the assistant supreme captain. Ethel was the head of the, MGT, the Muslim Girls Training Program. Herbert was the publisher of Muhammad Speaks, etc. And then, some of their, relatives were ministers, sons. Wallace, was a minister in Philadelphia, etc. That was at Malcolm's suggestion, by the way. But what becomes very interesting in all of this, though, is that it was the family who probably more than any group feared Malcolm the most, despised Malcolm the most, and wanted to weaken Malcolm's influence with Elijah Muhammad, and also to weaken Malcolm's power inside the Nation of Islam. And it's going to be Elijah Muhammad's family that's going to play a crucial role in everything, in Malcolm's ousting, and even reaching the point for Malcolm to be ousted. And in fact, this prompted one of Malcolm's, one former minister to tell me, he said, They said, it's interesting, Baba. They said, Malcolm, and I guess to appreciate this, you have to understand something else too. Malcolm was also the one who created this concept of the royal family. Those of you who have been in the nation, those of you who have studied the nation, you know that one of the titles that they like to, refer, that they used in reference to Elijah Muhammad's family was the royal family. Malcolm was the one who was promoting that too. And one minister told me, he said, Baba, it's kind of sad because Malcolm created the monster that destroyed him. Malcolm created the monster that destroyed him. So at any rate, by the time you get to late 1962, early 1963, these forces are now becoming stronger, and they're becoming more fearful of Malcolm. And so there's going to be a series of events that's going to begin to take place beginning in 1963. And what we need to understand is that the whole key to the royal family or any other ministers or other officials of the nation being able to weaken Malcolm, the whole key is Elijah Muhammad. And so what they're going to be constantly doing is vying for Elijah Muhammad's attention. They're going to be constantly telling him negative things about Malcolm, and anytime something goes wrong, they blame it on Malcolm. Well, messenger, it was Malcolm's responsibility for this, so if there was a problem last night, that's who you need to talk about. That's who you need to talk to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, things are going to begin to hit a head in February 1963. And by the way, the Bureau, another major character, in fact, the major character in all of this when you really get down to it, because, we need to be able to separate the puppet from the puppeteer. The Bureau, by the way, as they begin to get more and more intelligence about the conflict, as they begin to hear more and more from their informants' reports, from their telephone bugs, et cetera, they began to realize, by the time you get to 1962, that Elijah Muhammad is vulnerable. That is, if certain things can begin to happen, he can, in fact, begin to weaken his support for Malcolm. And they're going to start playing on that. And in fact, so much so that things are going to reach a head in February 1963. In many ways, this is going to represent the watershed, if you will. And what's at work here is that they're having the annual, Savior's Day celebration in Chicago. Elijah Muhammad, however, is in Phoenix. He's sick, and he decides to let Malcolm preside over this affair. But what's going to happen is almost every day for the 2 to 3 weeks before the Savior's Day convention takes place, Elijah Muhammad is going to be getting phone calls primarily from his family, and they're going to be complaining about Malcolm this and Malcolm that, and Malcolm's trying to take over, and Malcolm's trying to, act as though he's you, and Malcolm's doing this, and Malcolm's doing that. Even Elijah Muhammad's wife, Claire, who at one stage, used to really love Malcolm, even she would call up and say things like, Malcolm makes me sick. Or Malcolm is childish, or Malcolm doesn't want, he's acting like he's you, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is going to begin to play with Elijah Muhammad's mind. And then what's going to happen is there's going to be more conflict because during the Savior's Day program, Malcolm, who's presiding, is not going to give what the family thought was adequate time for Wallace to speak. Wallace was always considered to be, Elijah's most spiritual son. So that's going to create more friction. And then making matters worse is that Malcolm had made appointments to stay in Chicago for the next couple weeks on speaking engagements. And that bothered them too, because they said, he needs to go back to the East Coast. Who does he think he is now? And so Elijah Muhammad, again, all of these things are beginning to work on his mind. And of course, we should also not, underestimate some of the rumors that are also circulating during this time period about Elijah Muhammad and the secretaries and the babies. So these are likewise going to play a role in all of this as well. So it's going to reach the point whereby in March 1963, Elijah Muhammad had had enough complaints from his family. He'd had enough complaints from different ministers. And he's going to order Malcolm back to New York. And therefore, Malcolm's going to have to cancel all these speaking engagements that he had planned. Now, in many ways, I think this was very important. Because what that showed to me was the extent to which Elijah Muhammad was beginning to, how should we say, to punk out, if you will, to the pressure. And of course, the Bureau was clapping their hands. And in fact, this is then going to prompt a letter, a memo that the Bureau, that the Chicago Bureau, who's studying all of this, is going to write. And I think that was the letter that I read on Gill's program, in which they were then talking about how they had an excellent opportunity now, using various counterintelligence means, to separate Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, and they were not going to miss that opportunity. And this was very important, because remember now, prior to this, the Bureau did not have a chance, from their eyes, from their standpoint, to separate Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And if they could not separate Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, they did not have a chance to disrupt the national leadership. This is very important for us to understand. So now Elijah Muhammad is giving the enemy indications, evidence, that at this stage of the game, he's vulnerable. Then they're going to begin to unleash a series of rumors, saying things, again, they were old rumors actually, but what's interesting is that the Bureau is going to begin to concentrate them more. And all they do is they would tell some of their informants, this is what I want you to do. Start spreading around the mosque that you heard that Malcolm is planning to take over if Elijah Muhammad continues to be sick. And things like that. And just spread it. And of course, by the time something like that gets to Elijah Muhammad, by the time it gets to some of the, national leaders, it's even worse than that. That's how rumors work, as I'm sure everybody in this room probably know. So what's happening here? Seed planting. They're planting seeds. And the whole key to these seeds evolves around how Elijah Muhammad reacts. And of course, had Elijah Muhammad's position been simply, as it was in earlier years, look, I don't want to hear nobody in here telling me anything about Malcolm. Sharif, I don't want to hear it. Elijah Jr., I don't want to hear it. John Ali, I don't want to hear it. Ethel, I don't want to hear none of these rumors, all these innuendos and things about Malcolm. Malcolm is the best worker we have in the Nation of Islam, and all of y'all just jealous. Now get out of here. That was his earlier response. And he did that for years. But now, as you get into 1963, he's becoming more and more interested in these rumors. In fact, it's going to reach the point in which he's even going to solicit information. So what's going on now? What's the latest? Now, something is also going to intervene in the next couple months that's also going to have a very detrimental effect. What am I talking about? The babies. Malcolm is going to meet with him, and they're going to talk about the babies. And they're going to send each other, neither one of them is going to be direct when they discuss the babies. They're going to talk using, euphemisms. They're going to beat around the bush. And what's going to happen is these two men are going to leave that meeting. Malcolm is going to leave the meeting thinking that Elijah Muhammad has given me permission to talk to some, quote, some of the other trusted brothers, so that, to prepare them to deal with the babies and the rumors and all of this. And I think what I'm going to do, Malcolm said to himself, I'm going to go and talk to Wallace, and I think between the two of us, we can come up with some scriptures to justify it, based on what Elijah had just told me. I'm Malcolm now. So that's what Malcolm is going to leave with. And of course, soon after, he's going to start meeting with individual ministers and captains like Captain Joseph, telling them, well, you've been hearing rumors, and this is how we're going to handle it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Elijah Muhammad is going to leave that same meeting basically thinking, well, Malcolm has a plan that can keep this thing under wraps. That's what he left with. Now, He wasn't sure what Malcolm's plan was, but all he knew was Malcolm had a plan. And he also knew that Malcolm was a very sly, very analytical person, and therefore he felt good about it. He said, Malcolm is going to help solve this. And so obviously you had to be a genius to figure out you got two men with two opposing views of what had just happened. So Malcolm goes and tells some of the trusted ministers. And what do these trusted ministers and captains do? Down to the very last man. Each of them, when they talk to Malcolm, immediately calls Chicago, and they tell Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm is down here spreading lies about you and babies or something like that. And the irony is that most of them already knew about the damn babies anyway. They knew about it. But what they saw was, and what Malcolm underestimated, see, Malcolm really believed that there were certain people that he could trust inside the nation. And unfortunately, some of the people that he thought he could trust, he really could not trust. He just didn't know he couldn't trust them. And unfortunately, many of these were the brothers. And by the way, usually these brothers were referred to as Malcolm's ministers anyway. Because he was the one who appointed them, he was the one that nurtured them, he was the one that mentored them. So he just assumed that, you know, I can trust these brothers. Who were these ministers, by the way? Who were they? Well, we're talking, of course, we're talking about people like Minister Isaiah in Baltimore. We're talking about Lonnie Cross in Washington, D.C. Of course, you're talking about Lewis in Boston. Lewis X. Walcott then. But today, you know, he's, of course, Farrakhan.
What is his name now?
I just said, but today he's known as Louis Farrakhan. And, of course, Joseph now. Malcolm knew he couldn't trust Joseph, and it baffles me to this very day why he would even bother telling Joseph. Joseph Shaw, you know, who died, I think, on March 28, 1993. I haven't figured that one out yet, but he told Joseph, too. And, you know, Joseph and Malcolm had a love, you know, hell, it wasn't no love-hate. It was a hate relationship for a long time. So he told Joseph, too. And a few other ministers. Henry, assistant minister at Mosque number 7, and also the secretary at Mosque number 7. And all of them are going to call Elijah Muhammad basically saying the same thing. So if you're Elijah Muhammad, you get this information, how do you react? Well, this is the way Elijah Muhammad reacted. He said, you know, a lot of these things that people have been saying about Malcolm must be true. I can't trust Malcolm. And then what that's going to do is that's going to open him up even more to hear the negative energies, the rumors. And by the way, let's be very clear. The Bureau is going to do its share in spreading stuff, but the truth of the matter is that the Bureau didn't need to spread a whole lot of stuff. The nation, Malcolm had enough enemies inside the Nation of Islam, whereby the Bureau, and by the way, this became their strategy anyway. Malcolm had enough enemies inside the nation whereby the Bureau just had to kind of just sit back and just let nature take its due course, as a later FBI COINTELPRO against the Panthers and us organization. Just let nature take its due course. And that's basically what the Bureau is going to do. So as the year of 1963 begins to go on and on and on, the Bureau is going to do some interesting things. They're going to start planning newspaper articles. Now, one newspaper article is going to be very interesting. Remember this whole rumor about Malcolm trying to take over the nation, et cetera, et cetera? The Bureau is going to inspire, and remember now, the Bureau has a stable, if you will, of what they call certified friends of the Bureau, or friendly reporters. These are people who, when the Bureau wanted to sway public opinion, they would, a lot of times the Bureau would write the article themselves, then drop it in the lap of one of their friends. And the friend would either sometimes just print it word for word, or sometimes they might modify it a little bit, or sometimes they might just take the essence of the article and then put it in their own words. The Bureau is going to inspire a couple articles during the spring of 1963, which is going to make the point that Elijah Muhammad has retired and Malcolm X now heads the Nation of Islam. And of course, if you're Elijah Muhammad, at that particular time now, you're old, you're not feeling real good. In fact, you're very sick. That's the last thing that you want to hear. And then the whole babies thing is going down too. And then all these rumors that people, are saying about Malcolm X. Of course, this is going to make things even worse. But guess who's going to be blamed for it? It's not going to be, of course, nobody's thinking about the Bureau in those days, no. They're not going to even think about blaming the white media. They're going to blame Malcolm. Malcolm is going to be blamed for putting out energy like that. In other words, the philosophy is going to be, well, these white reporters wouldn't be writing this stuff if Malcolm wasn't giving them that ideal. So he's going to be blamed for that too. And people ain't going to be making a whole lot. And remember now, let's be very clear on something too. We ain't talking about brothers and sisters that's giving things a whole lot of analysis. You get my drill? In other words, we ain't talking about an organization that's going to be putting things under a microscope and analyzing things. Now, we're not talking about an organization that's going, that's thinking in lines that the enemy is going to try to destroy us, and we need to be very clear on that, and therefore take everything negative with a grain of salt, investigate it, probe it, etc., before we take a position on something. No, we're not doing that. We're talking about an organization that had leaders who were looking for any excuse they could find to take Malcolm down. Whether it was real or unreal, they wasn't particularly caring about that. Now, something else is also going to happen, and I'll also give you an idea of how the Bureau works. The Bureau overheard a conversation between Elijah Muhammad and, some Chicago official one day. This is the spring of 1964. Elijah Muhammad is in Phoenix, and of course they got his phone bug. Elijah Muhammad makes the statement. He says, I've been very sick lately, and I've been vomiting up a whole lot of things. The pain is real, real hard on me. And he says, sometimes I feel like just killing myself. That's what Elijah Muhammad said. And you know what the Bureau gonna do? For the next few days, there's gonna be a series of phone calls to Elijah Muhammad's Phoenix estate, telling him to kill himself, encouraging him to commit suicide. That's how the FBI works. They saw an opportunity to exploit a weakness, a problem, and they basically just jumped on it. And of course, he's probably not thinking in those lines. He probably thinks it was probably just a crank call. Why? Because our understanding of the intelligence community at that particular stage was not very mature, was not very sophisticated. So, at any rate, 1964 continues to move forward. And then there are some other challenges that's going to, also facilitate conflict between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. And one major challenge is going to be the whole issue of political involvement of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm, of course, kind of like led the more radical wing of the nation, which basically said, why can't our organization play a more direct role in the struggle of our people? Why must our organization always be on the sidelines? Why must our organization always divorce ourselves from the masses of our people? And of course, Malcolm was the one who was promoting this. And he was constantly getting on Elijah Muhammad's nerves, I should say, by trying to get the Nation of Islam to become more politically active. One of the things that Malcolm got sick and tired of hearing, and he used to hear it a whole lot in Harlem, was the Muslims talk a whole lot of stuff, but they don't do nothing unless a Muslim is hurt. And then people started realizing, hell, they don't even do anything when the Muslims are hurt. So this conflict is also going to create some problems. To the degree that it's going to give more ammunition to Malcolm's enemies among the Chicago leadership who are looking for something anyway. And this was their angle, by the way. If the messenger says that we are a religious organization, who the hell is Malcolm to try to make us be something that we ain't? Who does Malcolm think he is? He's talking about voting rights. He's talking about unity conferences and stuff with civil rights leaders. Who does Malcolm think he is? That was their angle. Because remember, inside the nation, the last word was Elijah Muhammad. End of discussion. Complicating things more also is that people are beginning to leave the nation in 1963 because the rumors are getting more and more heavy. And of course, you could also bet that the Bureau was doing their best to kind of help that along as well. So what's basically happening right now is you're setting the stage whereby it's going to reach a point by the time you get to the end of 1963 whereby Malcolm was on very thin ice, even though he did not know he was on thin ice. In fact, in many ways, a good illustration of this took place during the fall of 1963. Malcolm was trying to get Joseph set down as captain of Mosque No. 7. And so what he did was, he would talk to Elijah Muhammad on the phone, and then he also wrote a real penetrating letter to Elijah Muhammad. And this was his angle, by the way. He wanted to find, he wanted to use a formula similar to the formula that was used to temporarily sit down Clarence. Clarence Gill was the captain of Mosque number 11, which was the Boston Mosque, Farrakhan's captain. And for a short period of time, Clarence was set down. But he was set down not necessarily in name, but his duties. He was relieved of his duties for a while. And Malcolm wanted to use the same strategy against Joseph, so that way Joseph wouldn't be humiliated or anything, but at the same time, Joseph, who Malcolm viewed as an impediment to the Mosque No. 7 anyway, could then kind of get, he could kind of chill out for a little bit, and then hopefully Malcolm would come up with another scheme, maybe to get him transferred somewhere else or something like that. But this is what Malcolm didn't know. Remember now, at this stage of the game, Joseph was one of the best allies that the Chicago leadership had. In fact, in some ways, Joseph was a spy. He was constantly, when he sees Malcolm doing something or things that he didn't like, he was constantly reporting to Chicago. This is what Malcolm did yesterday. I think the messenger might want to hear about this. He did da-da-da-da. He called Elijah Jr., who would then pass it to Sharif, who would then pass it to Elijah Muhammad. And this is what Malcolm said, and this is what Malcolm did, da-da-da-da-da. So what ended up happening was Malcolm wrote this nice letter to Elijah Muhammad about Joseph. And this is what Elijah Muhammad did. He called Joseph. And he read Joseph the letter. He said, Joseph, I want you to know what your minister just wrote me. And he read it verbatim to him. And of course, this is a very important development, because what it really showed was the extent to which here's Malcolm trying to erode Joseph's base without him realizing that, no, his own base was being eroded. And of course, things will finally hit the fore with the whole Kennedy thing. And let's be very clear on that. The Kennedy thing was simply a way to take Malcolm down. The truth of the matter is that if it hadn't been the Kennedy comment in which Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad sit down these directors, and very clearly he did send down those directors. In fact, I've, come across one incident in which Malcolm talked to Elijah Muhammad. This was November 24th, 1963, 2 days after the assassination. And the last thing Elijah Muhammad said to Malcolm was, he said, remember, we don't want to make any comments about the Kennedy assassination. And Malcolm said, yes, of course. And of course, we know what happened about 10 days later. But the point is that the Kennedy thing was just simply an excuse. It was an excuse that Malcolm gave the national leadership. Because remember now, this was the scenario for the Kennedy thing. Malcolm was at Columbia University. He's speaking. And of course, he was asked to comment. But what happened was John Ali, the national secretary, who hated Malcolm's guts, even though at one stage they used to be buddies. In fact, they even shared a home, a duplex in Queens. Their families did. But at that stage again, he hated Malcolm's guts and was looking for anything. Malcolm makes this statement with John Ali right there in the audience, and John Ali simply went and made a phone call. Now, specifically what he said or to what extent he might have jazzed it up a little bit, we could probably just use our imagination. Even though, Malcolm did, by the way, say the other part of that, which he denied for a period of time about, chicken come home roost always made me glad, never made me sad or something like that. Yeah, he did it. He said it. But the point is that Malcolm's enemies inside the nation took advantage of that. Elijah Muhammad, who at that stage of the game was looking for an excuse, was given the excuse, and then Malcolm was suspended. At this stage, the Bureau goes to another level. In fact, immediately after Malcolm was set down, the Bureau prepared an article that they then sent to different newspapers. It was an article that was very critical of Malcolm. It basically patted Elijah Muhammad on the back for setting Malcolm down for making, quote, barbaric statements about a dead man, unquote. Yeah. Now, what was the goal here? Their goal now was to create a situation whereby Malcolm would not be allowed to re-enter the Nation of Islam. Rumors started being circulated more and more about Malcolm and the babies and Malcolm saying this or that. And something else, too, that's going to be very important. Very important. One of the stipulations of Malcolm's suspension was he could not communicate to the press. He could not make public addresses. And he really couldn't even conduct classes inside Mosque number 7, his mosque. But one of the things that the Bureau is going to be doing, and you can go back, by the way, and just check this out for yourself. Start around, December the 12th, and you can look at different newspapers. The Amsterdam News, New York Times, etc., Post, in which Malcolm is going to be in articles. In other words, there's going to be a lot of articles that's going to mention Malcolm's name. And in some of these articles, it's going to make it appear as though Malcolm was interviewed for it. He wasn't. And you have to ask yourself the question, who benefits in a situation like that? Here's a man, part of his stipulation of his suspension is he cannot communicate to the press. And yet you're going to find instances in which, if Malcolm wasn't quoted, they would say sources close to Malcolm, which again gave you the impression, if you were one of Malcolm's enemies, that he's still talking to the press. Now, why does this become important? This becomes important because Elijah Muhammad, during the first month of Malcolm's suspension, is going to be very angry at Malcolm. And the reason that he's going to be angry at Malcolm is that he's going to say that Malcolm hasn't taken his spanking, Malcolm hasn't kept his mouth shut yet, and until he shuts his mouth, Malcolm is not going to rejoin his organization. The Bureau knows this. And therefore, they're going to keep information like this constantly coming, constantly coming. And then by February, when it became even more clear that Malcolm did not have much of a chance to rejoin the nation, then they're going to do a very interesting thing, which I think was really just to put icing on the cake. They're going to prepare an article that they're going to prepare really a letter to the editor type of article, that they're going to then send to some of Malcolm's worst enemies inside the nation. Elijah's going to get one, the Muhammad Speaks editor's going to get one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting is that in this letter, it's going to be very, very, very negative about Malcolm. But the irony of ironies, though, is, and this is just baffling to me, even to this day, and I make note of this in the book, is it's very negative about Malcolm. But guess who Elijah Muhammad and other leaders of the nation is going to suspect wrote the damn article, the letter? Malcolm. Elijah Muhammad is going to tell someone, it sounds like Malcolm, doesn't it? Why would he write a letter and then send it all over to these people and stuff, negative about himself? That kind of defies logic. But of course, this is what's important. it continues to contribute to the atmosphere. And so what is this? This represents proof. Malcolm is now trying a backdoor approach. He can't speak publicly, or he's supposed to be. So now what's he doing? He's sending out letters. By the way, somebody else also began to send photographs of Malcolm. And Malcolm was suspected of doing that too. Oh, by the way, to the press. And what was the logic here? It was to keep Malcolm's, since he was isolated and he wasn't supposed to be talking to the press, it was to keep his name and his face alive. Malcolm was suspected, of course, of doing that as well. And then, of course, the Bureau also planted a series of articles. One article, very, very important, because what it talked about was, remember now, Savior's Day is coming up. This is 1964, Savior's Day is coming up. And one of these articles talked about, quoted Malcolm basically as saying that unless he was reinstated by the Savior's Day celebration, he was going to return to the national scene in a manner that would make his previous appearance pale in comparison. And of course, who was suspected of putting out that energy? Malcolm was. So this was viewed as a threat. So it's really not going to become any surprise to anyone that in early March, Elijah Muhammad is going to write Malcolm a letter, early March 1964, saying you are suspended indefinitely. And then a few days after that, Malcolm is going to decide it was time to make, one other thing of note. March 4th. On March 4th, conversation is going to take place between Elijah Muhammad and apparently Herbert Muhammad. And in this conversation, what they're going to be talking about is, Herbert is going to tell Elijah Muhammad, have you heard what? Well, and remember now, this is still part, Malcolm, this is still during the suspension. He's going to call Elijah Muhammad, he's going to say, have you heard what? Well, I just got reports. Malcolm spoke on NBC News radio last night. And check it out. He said on his radio program that you had reinstated him with full duties and full authority. Malcolm didn't talk on no damn radio on March 4th. And Elijah Muhammad's response, I have not done any such thing. In fact, I just wrote him a letter telling him that he was suspended indefinitely. The Bureau, planting seeds. At any rate, under the circumstances, any reasonable person at that stage of the game would probably realize that they were not going to be allowed to rejoin the nation, and that's what Malcolm did. And so that's when he announced his so-called Declaration of Independence. But now go back to that period of time, too, because this is also important. One of the things that Malcolm was most interested during the first month and a half after he, quote, left the Nation of Islam, he was very careful what he said about the nation. He was talking about how he wanted to, he felt he could continue to promote the ideals of Elijah Muhammad on the outside rather than on the inside. He even blamed everything on the national leaders, not Elijah Muhammad. In other words, he went out of his way in order to keep the peace. And then the Bureau is going to go to a new level of their struggle. And in this new level, what they're going to try to do is to create friction between Malcolm's group and Elijah Muhammad's group. And one of the ways they're going to do this is they're going to make it seem as though Malcolm was trying to compete against the nation. There's also going to be a conflict at Mosque 7 in mid-March 1964. A group of people are going to go to Mosque number 7, and they're going to claim Malcolm sent them, and, they were there to tell Joseph, They were there to see Joseph and to tell Joseph this and that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Elijah Muhammad gets a phone call. He then calls the New York City Police Department and said, if the New York City Police Department cannot stop Malcolm's followers from coming to my mosque in number 7 and harassing them, then, our own will take care of things. And of course, that gave the Bureau even more of an indication that they had the potential there for something. Now, pushing the story along, the spring, the next month, of course, Malcolm went to Africa. And yet, even though Malcolm was in Africa, it didn't stop the Bureau from continuing to do what they were doing. In fact, one of the things that the Bureau is going to do, they're going to write this before Malcolm went to Africa. And then they're going to send it, though, while, he was like en route. Specifically, this is April 10th, 1964. And what they're going to do is, first they're going to make a proposition. They're going to propose, that's going to be approved by Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director. They're going to propose writing a letter and signing Malcolm's name to it, and then sending it to Detroit Muslims. And this is what the letter is going to say. It's going to be from Malcolm. He's going to, A, encourage these brothers to join the MMI. B, he's going to attack Elijah Muhammad for, impregnating all those young sisters. C, he's going to accuse the nation of just basically being an organization that was just, designed to make the Muhammad family rich. And then 4, he's going to ask those brothers to join because his organization, unlike the nation, is going to be a serious organization. It's going to be about the struggle. So while Malcolm is in Africa, this letter begins to run its course. And of course, there's not going to be a whole lot of discussion about this, by the way. In other words, these brothers are not going to be, oh, wait a minute, let's make sure how do we know Malcolm wrote this, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to be nothing like that. They're going to accept it. They're going to pass the information on, and rumors are going to start circulating. Malcolm, he's really doing it now. He's writing letters and stuff to some of our, faithfuls, some of the original people, telling them, join him, and talking about our messenger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No discussion, no critique, no investigation. I mean, do the enemy got our number or what? Now, Malcolm returns in May, and remember now, he still hasn't said nothing negative publicly about the Nation of Islam, and he has not mentioned the babies or anything. And yet, during that spring, there was a series of articles published in Muhammad Speak, calling Malcolm a hypocrite, attacking Malcolm. Joseph wrote articles, James wrote articles, Jeremiah wrote articles, attacking Malcolm. And Malcolm hasn't said anything about the Nation of Islam publicly yet. And the reason that I emphasize this is because one of the things that Farrakhan and them try to make people think, because they know that the average person, isn't going to necessarily go back and, do a whole lot of research on this, is that as soon as Malcolm left the Nation of Islam, he immediately talked about the babies. That's what they want you to think. It's going to be 90 days, 3 months before he finally talks about the babies. And only after several attempts have been made on his life. So anyway, we're in the spring of 1964. Malcolm hasn't said anything about the nation, and they are attacking him left and right. They even went to his brother, Filbert, who was the minister of Detroit, even had Filbert attacking Malcolm in a series of articles, talking about Malcolm was, my family has a history of mental illness, and unfortunately, this illness has befallen my brother Malcolm, etc. Yeah. So all of this is happening, and that man hasn't, he hasn't fired a blow yet. In other words, he's going out of his way. He's doing things that, for the average person would be very difficult. But of course, don't get me wrong now, he's hurting. He's in a lot of pain. Because here's an organization he has spent 12 years building. And they're attacking him worse than they ever attacked the enemy. And it's hurting. But homeboy, apparently he's thinking about struggle. Maybe he's thinking about a lot of things. Hell, I don't know what he could be thinking about. Because like I said, most of us, we've been hitting by now. So then finally, in early June, after there had been attempts made on his life, after he was considered the worst hypocrite, blasphemous, heretic, and any other name you could imagine, lies, rumors, innuendos, everything about the man, he finally publicly talks about the babies. And his position when he first now, he said, had they left me alone, I would not have to talk about any of this. He viewed publicly discussing the whole babies thing as a means to prevent a war between those of his followers and those of the nation. That was his logic. Because his position was, remember now, members of the mosque that he was the minister of, many of them did not know anything about Malcolm's side of the story. All they knew was what the leadership was saying. And remember now, attempts had already been made on his life. In fact, attempts had already been made on Malcolm's life going all the way back to February. That's when Joseph started dropping seeds. That was during the suspension. Joseph dropped some seeds. And by the way, let me explain that real quickly. The way the FOI works is very similar to the intelligence apparatus of the United States government. The United States government, when they want to order something very sensitive, in other words, something criminal, something illegal, something immoral, something unethical, they don't say, okay, John, the CIA director, come in my office because I want to give you an assassination order. No. What they do is they come in there, they talk, but they beat around the bush. They use euphemism. They say nice words in order to mean something real negative. And what's supposed to happen is intelligence operatives are trained to pick up energy. So that you say certain things and the intelligence officer picks up what you said and they act on it. That's how counterintelligence works. Now, why? Because this is based upon a concept that the enemy calls plausible denial. What that means is that later on, if it's traced back, the president or whoever or some senior official say, no, that's not what I said. When John was, you talking about when the CIA director John was in my office that day? No, that's not what I said. This is what I said. I said that Patrice Lumumba was just one man and that the United States government shouldn't just let one man, we shouldn't worry about one man, interrupting our policies. That's what I said. That's how it works. Which, by the way, that's exactly what Eisenhower said on August 18, 1960, which led to, which was an order for the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And what made it an order? It was an order because the CIA director was in this meeting and he interpreted it as an order and he immediately authorized it. That's how it works. It's as simple as that. So years later, like when they had the church committee reports and they brought one by one all these former Eisenhower cabinet members who were in that meeting, they said, no, that's not what Ike said. Ike said this, that, that, and that. And it took one man, a man by the name of John H. Johnson, who said, look, I was in that meeting too. I was a staff person. I was taking notes and stuff. And when I heard him say that, and I saw him look at Allen Dulles, I interpreted that as an assassination order. But one thing is clear, Allen Dulles did, and that's all that matters. And that's how the FOI work too. Post-suggestion, that is, you give energy. I was talking to Muhammad Aziz. We know him as Norman 3X Butler, one of the men who did time for killing Malcolm, who did no more kill Malcolm than anybody in this room, unless one of Malcolm's assassins is in here. Get my drill? Remember at the start of the program I said that one assassin might come in. Okay. I was talking to Aziz, and I was asking him some questions about post-suggestion. And he said, in the New York FOI during the 60s, one of the things that they would say, suppose they wanted somebody taken out or beaten up real bad or something like that, the captain or a lieutenant would simply say, we need to take him to the park and bless him. And again, anybody else listen to that? Remember now, this is not for everybody's ears. It's only for one or two people's ears. So, at any rate, getting back to what I was telling you about Joseph. In February 1964, Joseph said some things to some people that was interpreted as an assassination order. And a couple of them attempted. They failed. Now, one thing I'm pretty clear of, though, is that at that stage of the game, that had nothing to do with the national leadership. In other words, I'm not convinced. Now, it's possible that Elijah Muhammad Jr., it's possible that Jr. could have had something to do with that. But I'm not convinced that Elijah Muhammad had anything to do with that. And remember now, Jr., Jr. was considered to be the real power of the FOI. Sharif, his brother-in-law, was really nothing more than a figurehead. Junior was the mouthpiece of Elijah Muhammad, however, and that's what complicates things. And usually what would happen is, if Elijah Muhammad wanted something done, Junior would be the one who would put out the energy. And a lot of times, since Elijah Muhammad never publicly said, that's not what I wanted happening, etc. In fact, they had a good case of this took place around 1961 in the Boston Mosque. There was a whole lot of problems, that was Farrakhan's mosque, whole lot of problems. And so what happened was, people were leaving because they were being beat up because they weren't selling all the Muhammad speaks, etc., etc. So Junior was sent in to solve the problem. And what happened was Junior got up before the, before the general body, and he said, look, in the old days, when people were shucking and jiving like some of you are in this room, we killed them. And the messenger fulfilled all. The messenger fulfills all. And of course, a lot of them quit right then and there on the spot. But this is what's important. Nobody was sure whether or not Junior was speaking for Elijah Muhammad or not. We don't know. But this much we know. Elijah Muhammad did nothing to change anybody's mind. In other words, he didn't come back and send a telegraph or something, which he was famous for doing when something went right, saying, look, what Junior said, for y'all disregard that. He's not speaking for me. He didn't do that. And therefore, leaving people the impression that Junior is still his mouthpiece. End of the story. So at any rate, Malcolm finally speaks. And of course, the war then goes to its worst stage. Because see, at that stage of the game, now this is very important. Once Malcolm publicly spoke, and there were a lot of reasons which I think explain why Malcolm spoke, finally, But once Malcolm spoke publicly, at that stage of the game, the Bureau could have stopped anything and everything they had on the agenda. They could have just closed their books with a smile on their face and left New York after that. Why? Because they knew the FOI well enough to know that at that stage, they were going to do the rest. The seeds had been planted well enough. The nation was going to do the rest. And see, that's what's so sad about all of this. Is that, people ask the question, were any of the assassin agents? Hell no, they didn't have to be agents. All they had to be was true believers. Because go back to June 1964, and you see very clearly the atmosphere. Elijah Muhammad gave a speech in Houston in June 1964, in which he declared Malcolm was the chief hypocrite, and then later on in that same speech he said that hypocrite needs to be blasted off the face of the earth. Now remember now, you are talking to an organization that feeds off of energy, post-suggestion, and you say stuff like that. Muhammad Speaks is going to publish a series of articles attacking Malcolm. In other words, just giving people the impression that the leadership wants this man to simply disappear. And all you need at that stage is a loose wire. And to be honest, you don't even need a loose wire. All you need is just a true believer picking up the energy. That's it. And he acts. And that's the end of the story. And this is what Malcolm is confronting in June 1964. Making things even worse is that Elijah Muhammad, spoke on June 28, 1964. Of course, that was also the same day that Malcolm launched the OAAU, Organization of African American Unity. Now, what's interesting, though, is that there was an FOI meeting that was held the day before Elijah Muhammad spoke. And by the way, this was probably icing on the cake, if you will. Junior spoke at this FOI meeting. And of course, Malcolm was the major issue. Joseph also spoke, several other people spoke. And what's interesting is that Junior declared that, well, first off, he called Malcolm some names. He called him, what did he call him? A long-legged, he called him a red, long-legged dog. But worse, he told the FOI now, and remember now, you got captains, lieutenants from all over the country assembled in this room. And he told them, he said, at the time, Malcolm, and the nation was engaged in a legal suit over the house. The nation was trying to evict Malcolm from the Queen's house that, from Malcolm's side, they had bought him. And then they were trying to, get him and his family evicted from it. So what Junior told the FOI assembly, he said, quote, "The nigga don't want to give up the house. All you got to do is go to the house, beat down the walls until it comes tumbling down, cut the nigga's tongue out, put it in an envelope, send it to me, and I will stamp it approved and give it to the messenger." Many people who I've talked to who were at that particular meeting said it was very clear to all of them that was an assassination order. You do what you're supposed to do to take Malcolm out. Now, making it worse, the Bureau strikes again. Somebody placed a phone call to that meeting in which they said, "I'm one of Malcolm's followers." Now, when the messenger comes to town, by the way, this was not the first time this was done either, but when the messenger comes to town, and when he speaks in town tomorrow, Malcolm has ordered his assassination. He's going to try to take him out. One of his followers is going to try to take him out. And of course, is there going to be a great intellectual investigation of this? Is there going to be a debate? Are they going to ask questions about all of this? No. Rumors are just going to simply separate to the degree that Malcolm wants the messenger taken out. So at the end of the month, the Bureau was very happy to report to their supervisors, the New York Bureau was happy to report to the supervisors that a state of war exists between the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X's organization. And at that stage of the game, the Bureau didn't have to do nothing. The seeds were planted. And then it was just a matter of time. And of course, Malcolm made it difficult at this stage of the game. By the way, the Newark assassination team that will ultimately kill Malcolm, they were already organized. In fact, they started organizing late May. A man by the name of Ben Thomas, who was the assistant secretary of Mosque number 25, age 28, worked in a paper factory in Hackensack. He and another brother by the name of Leon Davis, a young brother at that time, age 20, both FOI, approached Talmadge Hare, who had been in and out of the nation for good standing and bad standing, for beating up people, violating codes, etc. They approached him about May 30th, 31st or so, called him to their car saying, what do you think about what Malcolm is saying about Elijah Muhammad, etc., etc., etc. And then they recruited two other brothers. But that assassination team was already underway even before Junior made his statements. Now, Malcolm is going to make it difficult for them, though, because he's going to leave in July and he's going to be out of the country till late November. So that's several months. But by the way, did that stop the nation's newspaper from attacking Malcolm? No, you can go to September 11, 1964, in which Elijah Muhammad wrote a very negative letter about Malcolm, in which he said Malcolm was playing. And this is interesting now. Malcolm is out of the country. He'd been out of the country for 2 months, 3 months. Elijah Muhammad writes a letter dated September 11, 1964, in Muhammad's speech, in which he basically said that Malcolm is playing with fire, hot fire at that. And that was even before Malcolm, wrote a letter that appeared in the New York Times in which he said, he would never rest until he undid some of the harm that he caused innocent Negroes by, recruiting them into the nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was even before all that. So they're keeping it nice and alive. In October, Joseph and Jeremiah, two of Malcolm's other enemies, wrote an article, a joint article, in which they attacked Malcolm. And it's interesting because they also rewrote history, in which they tried to minimize the role Malcolm played in the nation. And then, of course, it was all highlighted then by Farrakhan's or Lewis X. Walcott's article, in which he basically, said Malcolm deserved death and all those other things. So this was so all of this is happening now. Now, Malcolm, at that stage of the game, had, he was back in the country by then. But the truth of the matter is that the nation was not going to let it rest. And yet, we're always given the impression that Malcolm just constantly stayed on their case and just constantly tried to attack the organization, so finally they had no choice. And then that's what we're taught. Now, in January, there are attempts made on Malcolm's life. Specifically, there was a January 22nd attempt outside his home. He's going to then fly to Los Angeles. There's going to be an attempt on his life. In fact, there's going to be a couple of attempts on his life, and likewise in Chicago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, February the 2nd is going to be an attempt made on his life in front of the Daily News building, and of course, a week later, there's going to be the house bombing, and finally, Malcolm's assassination, February 21st, 1965, 3:10 p.m. But the point is that there's going to be a series of attempts made on Malcolm's life. And many of the attempts, he's going to recognize the people were just basically FOI. Now, where do we go with all of this? Well, a couple places, and then I also want to say something about the police investigation, and then I think I'll say something about the trial, and then just kind of wrap down so we can have some good question and answer. And by the way, what time is it?
You got time.
Okay, so we good?
To the last spring.
Oh, okay, okay. The radio thing, has that brother called anything? Okay, fine. So, at any rate, the tragedy of all of this is the extent to which our enemies can provoke a war between two men who loved each other. Which could result in one of these brothers being wasted. And remember now, we're not talking about a hit. We're talking about being wasted. You don't go into a ballroom with 400 people. One of you sitting in the 4th row with a J.C. Higgins 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun. Another one of you sitting in the front row with a .38 Luger, and a third one sitting with a .45 caliber, point-blank range from me to you. You don't go in there with that type of ammunition to play games. You go in there in order to waste, in order to slaughter, and that's what they did. And you're gonna slaughter this man in front of his family. Now understand me clearly. That doesn't make it worse, because it can't get worse than what it was. But the point is, imagine the mentality of that type. In other words, Malcolm talked about a zombie mentality inside the Nation of Islam, but imagine what type of mentality we have to be talking about. And you're going to do it in broad daylight. You ain't worried about police. You ain't worried about nobody. In fact, making it even worse for Malcolm in all of this is that, remember now, Malcolm didn't really have no damn security. He didn't. In fact, this is how tight his security was. One of the rostrum guards from Jersey, a man by the name of Charles 25X Blackwell, standing up here on the corner here. No, actually, Blackwell was on the left corner. He's looking at the audience. And guess what? He recognizes the assassins before the assassination. In fact, so much so, they're constantly looking at each other, wondering, is he going to squeal on us? Is he going to say something in which they're going to check us? Because remember now, the whole key to them killing Malcolm is, it was a 5-man murder team. Okay, and I've named, Benjamin Thomas, who, by the way, Benjamin Thomas was killed on October 28, 1985. He took a .357 Magnum to the head, point-blank range in Apopka, Florida, in some type of family dispute. Leon Davis, he was the one with the 38. Talmadge Hare, who we all know, he was one with the 45. Wilbur McKinley, who was also from Newark, he owned a construction company. He was also the oldest member of the assassin team. He was the one that caused the disturbance and threw the little smoke bomb, which is really nothing more than a sock that had some matches in it that they just threw. But at any rate, Blackwell, who was a former member of Mosque number 25 and the Jersey Mosque, is looking at these men throughout the thing, and then they in turn would look at each other, wondering, I know what I was doing. I was trying to explain how they got in. They sent the 2 men who didn't have weapons in first. And by the way, they came very early, hoping that they can get in before, in the event that Malcolm Hughes started checking people, they could get in before all of that happened. So they came in early, before people were really all that set up. And their whole thing was, let the 2 brothers who don't got no weapons, that is, Wilbur and Thomas, walk in first, and if they're not checked, then the other 3 can walk in. If they're checked, the other 3 is going to walk and just turn around. That's how they had it set up. So you got Blackwell over here looking at these men, and they're wondering, is he going to drop a dime or not? Now check this out. They also got a man over here by the name of Robert 35X Smith. He's also recognizing them. We don't know whether he knew all of them or some of them. But he had dealings with the mosque as well, so he's looking at this too. So they're looking at both of these men. Are they going to drop a dime? Are they going to drop a dime? And guess what? Neither one of them dropped a dime. But check this out, though. On the right-hand side, facing the stage, which would be right here, they had Linwood. Linwood, he was the lieutenant. He was the lieutenant of Mosque number 25. Yeah. And of course, the assassin team apparently was part of his squad. The lieutenants, had squads inside the nation. That was apparently part of his squad. So he was there just to witness it. But check it out now. One of Malcolm's more loyal, unlike these 2 punks here, one of Malcolm's more loyal guards noticed Linwood. He said, wait a minute. I've seen that brother before. Plus, he had an FOI pen, too, which I always thought was very suspicious as to why. See, he had an FOI pen on him. And I think that what was probably going on, now, is one or two ways to explain it. A, he made a mistake before he walked in. He should have took it off. He forgot. It's possible. But I think more probable what happened was he was specifically there to draw attention to himself and to take it off anybody else. So what's going to happen is Whitney, George Whitney, one of Malcolm's loyal followers, he's going to notice Linwood. And he's going to, get a couple brothers, yo, man, this brother, sitting in the front row. Well, I think we should, check him out. Okay. So they're going to invite him to the back. They're going to invite him to the back and say, yo, brother, why are you here? And he's going to say, well, I'm a little bit disenchanted with, with what's happening in the nation, and I thought I'd come and check out Malcolm's program. Now, this was tragic too, though. They ain't going to frisk the brother. They're going to say, well, look, brother, you can stay in, but first you got to take off the pen. Then they're going to let this brother come and just sit, cop a squat right back up front again. And it gets interesting because right after the assassination, you know, when, you know, everybody is, you know, the assassins have left and stuff, you know, Linwood, you can see him in a picture. He's standing over Malcolm's body, basically, with his coat across his arm. He's looking down at Malcolm with a smile on his face, laughing. And by the way, the police knew this. The FBI knew this too. Was he ever investigated? Was he ever interviewed? I have no evidence that he was. You find it suspicious? An FOI lieutenant from a neighboring mosque? And then, remember now, let's figure this out. Talmadge Hayer is going to be the only one arrested at the scene. The Bureau is going to know immediately that he was a member of Mosque number 25. In fact, they're even going to know immediately that the last time he attended a meeting was only 2 months earlier. That's what the Bureau documents are going to say. So let's kind of walk through this. Now, during the investigation, a man by the name of Leon Amir, he was going to be the captain of the New Haven, Connecticut mosque, and he's going to ultimately defect. He's going to become an enemy. He's going to be almost beaten to death in Boston twice in the same day. And of course, you know, Clarence, who was the captain there, they really tried to kill the man, to be frank with you. But anyway, he's going to survive. But what's interesting is that he's going to come in for Malcolm's funeral. And while he's here, thank you, Baba, he's going to talk to several members of Malcolm's group who were at the assassination. And one of these brothers is going to say he recognized 2 of the assassins as members of the Newark Mosque. Now, the Bureau is going to get this information. A couple weeks later, Leon Amir is going to die. The Bureau is going to keep this information for 6 months, and then they're going to pass it to the NYPD. Now, this is why I'm telling you this. You got Talmadge Hayer from Paterson, New Jersey, who, according to Bureau documents, is a member of Mosque number 25. You got Linwood, a lieutenant of Mosque number 25, sitting with a front row seat. And you got the evidence of Leon Amir telling you that one witness to the assassination recognized 2 of the killers as members of the Newark Mosque. Now, let's use some simple logic. You mean to tell me that the enemy of our people did not know within a month after within 1 week of the assassination, the enemy of our people did not know that the assassins came out of Mosque number 25. What are we, Willie Lumps or something? Now, what did the Bureau do in all of this? Well, they investigated, particularly the charges that 2 of them, were from Mosque number 25. And they simply, looked into it and they said, well, now check this out now. They said that it was difficult for them to verify a lot of this information because in the nation, the people had a lot of different numbers in front of their X's. So it was difficult trying to investigate information like that. Now check this out. If you were a bureau informant, this is what you were paid to do during this period of time. You were paid, and by the way, the bureau paid well. You were paid to attend meetings. And at these meetings, you were paid to make note of everybody in the meeting, which meant you had to be on top of it because you had to know their slave names, you had to know their Arabic names, and any other names that they had. And you also had to know when the last time this person was here, etc., etc., etc. The point that I'm making is that it's about as asinine as it gets. That's about as lame of an excuse as you's ever gonna find. But of course, we knew what was going on. The Bureau wasn't interested in solving this situation. Why? Because it was the Bureau who helped to feed the NYPD Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson. In fact, if I can find it, let me just read something real quickly. This is from a Bureau document. And what they're doing is they're going to be talking about Johnson and they're going to be talking about Butler. You know, two men, you know, who were framed for killing Malcolm, who did no more kill Malcolm than I killed Malcolm. And I think I was 5 years old when Malcolm was killed. Okay, listen to this. This, by the way, is a memo that was dated on the day, Asante Baba. This memo was dated on the day that Norman Butler was arrested, which was February 26, 1965, 5 days after the assassination. Now, this is a Bureau document. Blank advised that photos of Butler and Johnson have been shown to apparently Audubon witnesses, and none have been able to identify these individuals as being observed at the Audubon on the date of the shootings. In view of the fact that Butler and Johnson have not been known to have been anywhere in the vicinity of the ballroom at the time of the shooting, blank, apparently the New York Bureau, have not questioned them. These are going to be the same two men that the Bureau is going to build the case against these two men. Do you get my drift? Playing games with people's lives. Now, you have to ask yourself a question though, and that is, okay, now, can everybody see this? Okay. Can everybody see it? Okay. What happened was a paper, one of my, what do you call them things? Yeah, one of my bookmarkers just fell, right? And it fell on my foot. So it's on my foot right now. Okay, now this is what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to lift, now I was an athlete, you know, when I was in college, you know. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to lift my foot to see whether or not I can get my bookmarker before it falls to the floor. Okay, everybody with me? Yeah. Okay. Give me a hand, give me a hand.
Let's go to your file, too.
I appreciate that. Now, I know I was making a very significant point, wasn't I? Can somebody help me out? Where was I? after that one, huh? Can somebody help me out? I'm being serious. Where was I? Okay, thank you, brother. Yeah. Imagine that. They know. And this is the question I wanted to raise to you. We're going to have to explain something. If the enemy knows that these two men are innocent. Why isn't the Bureau going to Newark, finding the true assassins? Because with all of the sources that they had inside Mosque number 25, they knew. Why aren't they going get the true assassins and kill two birds with one stone? You know what? That's what I was hoping. Because you know why? Because see, that sounds better, doesn't it? See, me as an African person, and I'm gonna be honest with you, when I began this project, you know what my reasoning was? I wanted to exonerate the nation. I said, ain't no way in hell you're gonna tell me that our own is gonna take out Malcolm when they ain't taking out nobody else. They ain't taking out the enemy. When they took out Ronald Stokes in 1962 in Los Angeles, and made a cripple out of another brother, they didn't take out none of them. When they busted Hinton Johnson's brain in New York, they didn't take out none of them. So my logic was, give me a break. So you're gonna tell me that they're gonna take out Malcolm. Oh, give me, the man who helped to build the organization and stuff. No way. That's when I began this project. That was my logic. I wanted to exonerate the nation. So to go back to my sister's response, I wish that was it. Why? Because it looks better. I wish I could come up before my people and say, because I don't give a damn, I'm not going in front of white people, but I wish I could go in front of my people and say, bam, here it is. The enemy paid agents, and these agents went in and took out the brother. Because, you see, that sounds a lot better than our own took him out. Now, unfortunately, something else I think is at work here. And remember now, this would have balled it up nice and handy, wouldn't it? Had they just said, look, we're going to go get the true killers, and the whole world is going to know that the nation killed Malcolm. But you know why the Bureau didn't do that? Because the Bureau itself would have been in a vulnerable position. Why? Because questions would have to be raised. See, if the Bureau could come up with evidence linking these people to Malcolm's assassination, one of the questions that our community especially is going to ask, if you had this information, why the hell didn't you do anything with it before it happened? In other words, the same sources that the Bureau is going to use in order to be able to show that these men killed Malcolm, that same evidence would have indicted the Bureau and made the Bureau negligent in Malcolm's assassination. So they're covering their asses right now. So whereas this whole New York thing, all they needed here was just a few witnesses, a few lying witnesses. In other words, nothing counterintelligence came out or anything like that. The Bureau was in the background in all of this. Even though, check this out, one thing that the Bureau did was this. The Bureau accumulated a list of Audubon witnesses that they then gave to the NYPD. And when the NYPD wanted to know who was there or who they should interview, they would go to the Bureau and say, can we look at your list? And the Bureau would then direct them. This person right here, I think you should interview that person. This person right here, you should interview that person. And then what they ended up doing was they assembled one of the most comical groups of witnesses, of eyewitnesses, ever assembled inside a courtroom. And these are going to be the people who are going to end up convicting, leading to the conviction of Johnson and Butler. It's chemical. I mean, it's comical to look at these people. You got one brother saying, they were testing his ability, his ability to observe, his analytical skills, because he was giving all these details about, him seeing Butler killing Malcolm. And as proof of that, they asked him, what year was John Kennedy assassinated? Remember now, this is 1966. He said, oh, that's simple, 1965. You're going to believe this man. Another man, an elder from the Cape Verde Islands. He's going to finger Butler. going to tell the court that the man who was actually a defense lawyer was the police detective who took him down to the police precinct to identify Butler. And why did that question come about? He was testing his keen observation skills. Two witnesses changed their stories between their grand jury appearance and their trial appearance, and admitted that they lied. And you know anything about courtroom, you know that, when you yourself admit that you lied, your credibility ain't worth a damn. Two of them did that. These, by the way, were the star witnesses. One of them, was our friend Charles 25X Blackwell, the one who punked out. Another brother named Ronald Timberlake, he probably gave the most interesting testimony, because he was lying so much in his testimony to seeing Butler there that he also stated in his testimony that Butler was caught by the crowd and nobody touched him. And this is very important. You understand my point? Because see, if Butler was caught by the crowd, then that's a sticky problem for anybody, because you have to explain, if he was caught by the crowd, then why is it that it took 4 or 5 days later for him to be charged? What happened to him? In other words, that should have been grounds to just throw his stuff out. That's ridiculous. They didn't even probe it. Oh, by the way, there's a happy ending with this guy, though, because he was one of the people that was interviewed for the 60 Minutes thing and that aired in 1981. Yeah. And one of the things that he said was, he told Mike Wallace and him, he said that the police lineup at which he identified Butler was contrived, was a phony, was a setup by the NYPD. He also admitted that Johnson, who he also knew, he knew both Johnson and Butler were not even at the Audubon where Malcolm was assassinated. By the way, I figured out how they set up the police lineup, and it's interesting how they did it, which will ultimately lead to Butler especially being framed. The assassin who fired the .38, Leon Davis, he had a salt and pepper tweed coat. And this is what's going to happen. People, even if they don't remember his face, they certainly going to remember that coat. Butler, ironically or skeptically, or hell, I don't know what you say, but he coincidentally, he happened to own a similar coat. So what they would do is they would bring the potential witnesses into a room that had a peephole. In one room was the witness. The peephole is where they were going to have the line. And what they do is they get 5 or 6 people to stand in line. The five of these people would be police detectives, plain clothes. Then they would bring Butler in there and put him next to them. But they would always make sure Butler had his coat on. So what would happen is the DA would then tell this witness, now, look through the peephole and tell us which one you recognize. And it got ridiculous one time, so ridiculous one time that this one witness, who's going to later become, again, one of the star witnesses, it got so ridiculous one time that the DA man, he's going to say, is the one in the tweed coat the one who shot Malcolm? That's how confident they had gotten. I guess you can begin to figure out why, sometimes I'd have to, stay away from this research when I was working on it. It kind of got ridiculous, didn't it? Okay, so at any rate, so the Bureau is going to feed Butler and Johnson to the wolves, and at the same time, it's going to allow the true assassins to just go on about their business. Now, a few other things that I want to say, though, as far as the investigation is concerned. How about this? The prosecution and NYPD is going to contend that the person who fired the shotgun was Thomas 15X Johnson. Johnson was about 5 feet 10, light-skinned, stocky. Now, the person who actually fired the shotgun, excuse me, was a brother named Leon Bradley. Bradley was about 6 feet 1, dark skin. Couple 100 pounds. Now, remember now, the Bureau is going to be working very diligently to get Johnson convicted as the man who fired the shotgun. Now, check this out. On the day of the assassination, the FBI headquarters was sent reports, immediate reports, based on eyewitnesses, that is, Bureau informants who were at the assassination, in which they described most of the assassins. I'm going to read you something. This was a Bureau report that Hoover got. It was sent on the day of the assassination. Which is important, I think, too, because it kind of gives you an indication that, things are fresh on people's minds, the descriptions and stuff. You understand what I'm saying? Now, listen, compare the description of this assassin to to William Bradley, who really did fire the shotgun. And then contrast that to Thomas 15X Johnson, who's 5'10", light-skinned. Quote, description of only one other assailant has been determined. He is a Negro male, age 28, 6 feet 2 inches, 200 pounds, heavy build, dark complexion, wearing a gray coat, and believed to be the assailant who used shotgun, unquote. And that same Bureau, when the trial begins, is going to do its best to use its arsenal to convict a man that it knew clearly did not even fit the description of the shotgunner. And I guess one other point, or actually it's actually 3 points coattailed. One of the things that my research has found too is it appears that Boston played a role in the assassination. Let me tell you what I got here. A couple things, circumstantial at best though. Okay, first, we know that Joseph, was set down in June 1964 by Junior, who flew in to to New York, because he said Joseph was not doing enough to destroy Malcolm. Now, what they did was they replaced Joseph with Clarence, the captain of the Boston Mosque. And one of the first things that Clarence did, according to Leon Amir, was to approach him, Leon Amir, along with John, who was the captain of the Springfield Mosque, to get a silencer to kill Malcolm with. And according to Leon Amir, at that stage, Clarence was in charge of the assassination team. That's one thing. Another thing is that Minister Lewis left Boston during the early morning hours of February 21st, 1965. That is before the assassination. And drove to Newark and spoke at Newark that day. And of course, Newark, the home of the assassins. Coincidental? Possibly. And then finally, a letter was sent in June 1964 to the Suffolk County Superior Court, the probation office. And, you know, Suffolk County, that's the county that Boston is, I don't know what you call it, a member of or whatever. And this is what the letter said. It was apparently written by someone who knew some type of inside information about the assassination. And the crux of the letter, I'm going to read it in a second, but the crux of the letter is that they're identifying, and they gave the person's name, one Boston member as being part of the assassin team. And by the way, if you count the number of spaces in the person's name, the name Clarence Gill, the captain, can fit. Blank, black Muslim, said to be hiding in another state with gunshot wounds due to the fact that he was involved in the killing of Malcolm X. Try questioning his wife. Florida is a likely place. He was on probation. Unquote. Clarence, by the way, and several other members of Boston Mosque were also on probation, mostly for beating up defectors. So, again, circumstantial at best. But when you begin to realize that Boston, on June 14th, 1964, when Malcolm was in Boston, you know, members of the Boston Mosque tried to kill Malcolm, but, you know, without knowing that Malcolm had actually already left. When you begin to realize that, and then the fact that Minister Lewis and Clarence were in the forefront of the nation's campaign to get Malcolm punished, then it doesn't become all of that coincidental. But again, circumstantial. Because one thing we know is the role that Newark played. By the way, somebody else played a very significant role that we don't want to forget, and that, of course, was Joseph. Joseph received a phone call within minutes of the assassination. And the person who gave him that phone call, who I believe was Linwood. Oh, brother, you don't mind if I keep pointing to you as if you... Okay. Okay. All right. I appreciate that. Joseph received a phone call within moments of the assassination. He was given a step-by-step blow, detailed step-by-step blow of how everything happened. And it was somebody who was here, who probably just left the building maybe right after, you know, Linwood, you know, got his look of Malcolm, you know, look at Malcolm, and then went to a nearby phone. But Joseph was a major player. And as far as I can ascertain, Joseph was the point person in the assassination scenario. He also did something else that was very strange. I was talking to Butler some months ago, and Butler told me that there was something that has bothered him to this very day. He said after Malcolm's assassination and word started going around, he talked to Joseph. And he said Joseph told him, he said, brother, go next door to one of your neighbors and borrow an egg. He said, go next door to one of your neighbors and borrow an egg. Who gets it? What are we saying? Oh, no, not exactly, Brother Earl, but I appreciate the creativity, though. Anybody else? No? Yes?
I didn't hear what he said, but I believe that, Boston is closest to the north.
Okay. All right, I see what you're saying. Now you said Boston?
Boston.
Okay, right. Not exactly, brother. Anybody else? Oh, okay. No. I appreciate it, brother. Yes. Now, which is similar to what they said, but you know what? I think that's real creative. I do, but not exactly. I saw a hand right here. Yeah, brother. Yeah, good, brother. He said as a for witness. In other words, what he was telling Butler was to go and get a witness that you were in your apartment at the time of the assassination. And Butler didn't do it. And he said to this very day, even though, to be honest with you, it wouldn't have mattered. The truth of the matter is that people came to visit both Butler and Johnson that day, and they testified, and they ain't no more believed them either. But the point is, and the question you need to ask yourself is Butler that, is Joseph that sharp? You understand what I'm saying? Was Joseph that sharp that he suspected that the Bureau or somebody was going to suspect Butler? Based on what we know about Joseph, Joseph wasn't that sharp. So it leads us to either, we can either look at this one or two ways. One way is that he called all of his lieutenants and all of his officers that the Bureau might want, that the enemy might want to go after, and told them that. Well, I don't got no evidence he called anybody else. He could have. I just don't got no evidence of it. So if he didn't, and he just called maybe a Butler and possibly even a Johnson, then we have to ask ourselves a question: what exactly did Joseph know that we didn't know? I'm not saying he's connected to the Bureau, but what I'm suggesting is that somehow the possibility exists that maybe somebody had some type of inside thing and, and just knew very early on, that they were going to go after, maybe it was just that they were just going to go after mosque number 7 people or something. The truth of the matter is that all I can give up is just possibilities and stuff. But I would be hard pressed to believe, however, that Joseph was Bureau or anything like that. And clearly, if he was, the Bureau documents, they sure go after him enough. I'd be hard pressed to believe that. Now, one other possibility though, is that it is highly possible though that members of the nation, and I'm specifically thinking about maybe leadership-oriented people, may have been given energy to the effect that if y'all ice Malcolm, the NYPD, the Bureau, and some of these other groups are not going to be breaking our necks to see that justice is served. In fact, we got evidence of that anyway, because when Malcolm was in Boston, the Boston police served as security for him. And one cop told a Boston FOI person, who then passed the information on to Elijah Muhammad. He said, and I'm speaking for some of my comrades, he said, I am not, I repeat, I am not gonna take a bullet that was meant for Malcolm. We had similar situations taking place from the NYPD. Now, why is this important? This is why this is important. It's important to the degree that it gave the national leadership the indication that if they could somehow get by Malcolm's security, they really didn't have to worry so much about the enemy's security of Malcolm. And by the way, one other line of evidence that's important here too, and that is, remember now, an attempt was made on Malcolm's life on July 3rd, 1964, in front of his home. Malcolm immediately called the NYPD, who then sent us a patrol car. Now, what's important here is this. The next day, the NYPD, taking the lead of the Bureau did it first. They declared that that the assassination was a hoax that was concocted by Malcolm as a publicity stunt. And then the NYPD said the same thing. Now, this was very important because what it's doing is it's putting out the energy that the security apparatus of the enemy is not, I repeat, is not interested in securing Malcolm's life. And of course, we're going to see a similar situation after the house bombing. Because remember now, the NYPD is going to declare the house bombing as a hoax to the degree that Malcolm bombed it himself. Now, why is this important? What it's going to do is it's going to play a role in stripping Malcolm of his security on February 21st. Because remember now, let's follow this. Let's take this step by step very quickly because I feel like it's time to kind of wind down here. Plus, the other thing is that, I've been drinking, a whole lot of, water and juice. So I'm feeling that it's time to start winding down. This is a perceptive audience. They catch on real quickly. Now, let's follow this one real closely. You're Malcolm X. You've had instances in which in which the enemy has accused you, in one instance, of a publicity hoax in saying that somebody tried to kill you in July 1964. And even worse, when your house is firebombed with your babies and your wife in it, they've accused you of doing it yourself for publicity. Are you going to be suspicious? And of course, you're a brother anyway, living in the belly of the beast. So you're going to be suspicious of the enemy any damn way. You're going to be even more suspicious a week later. So, follow me here. You're in the Audubon ballroom, and the police sends about 20 cops to secure you, for your security. The same police that didn't even take threats against your life seriously, that planted a damn bottle to make it seem as though you bombed your own house. What you gonna tell them? What should you have told them? And what would any reasonable people tell them? I don't want you here. Remember that they sent a large group. And see, that wasn't accidental. They sent an extremely large group. You can predict, and remember now, the way counterintelligence work, they feed off of human nature, which means they create situations and they say the person can only react in one or two ways, this way or that way. The odds are he's going to react in that way. Now, why was this important? That's not what they were talking about. They planned to get out of there. So they set up, the NYPD and the Bureau set up a scenario whereby Malcolm's own organization was going to request a weak presence of the police. And of course, that made it easy for the assassins to get in there, A, and B, it also was going to set the stage for the enemy to then frame up whoever the hell they wanted, provided those people can get away. Because remember now, whoever they capture was going to have to stand trial. That's how Talmadge Hare was, I guess he was just unlucky. But remember now, the other four, they got the hell out of there. No trial for them. So what I'm suggesting to you is, knowing how counterintelligence works, this was a very, very sophisticated move on their part. And of course, the NYPD got their hands clean because they say, look, you can't blame us. We sent a team. We've offered him protections. And by the way, they did offer him protection. But under the circumstances, any reasonable person has to turn down that protection. Wait. That's like taking my case to the criminal. I'm going to ask you to cover my back? The reason I got all these damn knife marks in my back right now is because of you. It's the same analogy that Malcolm used when he talked about Shombe in the Congo, saying Shombe is the only one who can, who can save the Congo. Malcolm said, that's like saying Jesse James, the bank robber, is the only man who can save the bank. Therefore, we should let Jesse James guard the bank. Well, hell, the only reason the bank was in trouble in the first place is because Jesse James was already in the bank. So that was a perfect setup. And of course, for Malcolm's men, no excuses. Malcolm had a security that was inept, that was disorganized, that was not sensitive or taking the threats against his life serious. And one of the tragedies of all of that is that Malcolm really, really, really didn't have his back covered. Now, I know, people have gotten on programs and, they've cried and everything, but the truth of the matter is we didn't need crying. What we needed was for them to be more serious. Now, I also know that they had certain restrictions that they had to operate under. And one of the restrictions is that Malcolm, didn't want them being searched. And Malcolm preferred that they not carry guns. I know that. But under the circumstances, when you know this man's house has just been firebombed, you know that organization because you was a member of that organization, you know the mentality of that organization, you know that in order to protect Elijah Muhammad, some of them would shoot their own mamas and babas. When you know all of that, it's still your responsibility to make sure that that man's back was covered. And they didn't. And we can play with it, we can excuse it, but they didn't. And in fact, as one former analogy, and then I'm gonna stop at this stage. And then if it's all right, I want to stop, and then I need to run to the bathroom, and then I'm gonna come back and then entertain some questions.
Believe me, you'll get it.
Okay, I appreciate it. In some ways, Malcolm's group was under restrictions similar to, some of y'all remember Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle, was the president of France, right? Now, de Gaulle, like Malcolm, he was a real tall man. In fact, he was taller than Malcolm. De Gaulle was around 6'7", 6'8", so he was a large target. And what happened was, de Gaulle, had a lot of enemies in France. And he was, and they were constantly threatening his life and all of that, and he had a large security force. And his position was, they preferred that he not make public appearances. And his position was, I'm not gonna not make public appearances. He said, your job is, I'm going to make public appearances. Your job is to do what you need to do to cover my ass. So I'm putting it back on you. And so it made them work harder. If he was going to make a public appearance, they had to check all these things. They had to have people stationed everywhere. They had to do all these things. But those were the restrictions. Malcolm's people had similar restrictions. And it was still his people's responsibility to make sure that his back was covered. And it wasn't. And I think that that's one of the great lessons that we're going to have to deal with as we probe the assassination of Malcolm X. Now, on that note, I'm going to bring this to a close. I'm going to make a dash to the bathroom, and then I'm going to be back, ready to go.
Sisters and brothers, before you leave, remember there'll be no lecture this week, but on the 6th, we'll be back here in full swing. The 6th, make sure you take the flyer. I just want to share some information with you.
Brother Charles Kenyatta play.
In the assassination? Or
Well,
something more specific?
In Malcolm's, in association with Malcolm.
Okay, is that the only question? Okay. Kenyatta was one of the people, who was part of Malcolm's inner circle. Even though they would go back and forth. There was a time, particularly, and you have to excuse me, because for some privacy reasons, I can't go deeper than this. But there were some challenges while Malcolm was abroad, while he was in Africa during the summer of 1964, that created even more of a schism between between Malcolm and Charles. But by the time, Malcolm was back, prior to his assassination. Kenyatta was pretty much in better standing, if you will. Perhaps in privacy, I might go more in detail about what I'm talking about. But as far as, Kenyatta's, loyalty and things like that, I don't have any evidence that, he was part of any type of schemes or anything like that. And I think that overall he had Malcolm's best interests at heart. So no, I haven't come up. Now, there's more suspicion around James Shabazz, James 67X Warden, who I understand is now back in the New York area after spending the last 15, 20 years in, Guyana. One of the criticisms of James, and this was primarily the criticisms of many of Malcolm's followers, is that first off, usually he would introduce Malcolm, or he would, and if he didn't introduce Malcolm, he would usually be right out front in everything. He stayed back in the Audubon. That was, that surprised some people. But I think even worse is that once he came out after all of the shooting, and you can see this, by the way, on tape. You can see him. He showed great disconcern about Malcolm's plight. He showed little emotion. He seemed as though he just really didn't give a damn. And so that had some people thinking, what's James' problem? And then one other thing that's interesting is that Elijah Muhammad, a few weeks after the assassination, invited James to rejoin the Nation of Islam. So again, circumstantial, even though we still have to explain, though, his response. I mean, your brother, has all these bullet holes in him, and you just kind of look and, well, okay. And then you go on about your business. That's very suspicious. And I know I have questions about that. Some of the other things, circumstantial at best, but you really have to explain that. All right, brother. How you doing, brother?
There was another person who played a very important role in infiltrating Malcolm's organization, was Eugene Roberts, and who later infiltrated the Black Panther Party. Can you go into elaboration on what was his role?
Yeah. Well, Roberts, was a member of BOSS, Bureau of Special Services and Investigation, which was the Red Squad, or the Secret Counterintelligence Unit, of the NYPD. And, he infiltrated Malcolm's organization to the degree that he became an officer. He was the recording secretary of the OAAU, actually. Now, I know there's been a lot of speculation about Roberts and his role in the assassination and all that. I actually come from a different angle. I used to think, before I started probing it more, that Roberts, he was just part of everything, and, he was just a conspirator, etc. But then one of the things that kind of muddied the water as far as Roberts is concerned is that, originally when he was, reporting back, to his supervisors, he would bring back, very negative information about Malcolm, which is what they're supposed to do. But then something that started to change, and he began to bring back less and less negative reports. So much so that it reached a point whereby some of his supervisors in BOSS began to question his loyalty. In other words, they were wondering, is this man getting too close to Malcolm? To the degree that they were going to snatch him off the case. My own position, and this is based in part on, some of the interviews that Roberts has given, and also, some other sources. My own inkling is that I think that Roberts began to fall under Malcolm's spell. And I think originally, he saw a man who was subversive. He saw a man who was radical. He saw somebody, and with his brainwashed mentality, who was trying to destroy his country and all that. But then I think as he got closer into the inner circle, he realized that Malcolm was really a decent person, a sincere person. And I think that his loyalty to the enemy really was suspect. So I'm saying all that basically to say this. I think that when he, for example, tried to revive Malcolm using mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which, by the way, when somebody has a chest wound like that, the worst thing you can do is mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But I think that he was being very sincere. And I think that unlike even some of Malcolm's other people, and I'm sure this probably will surprise some people, I didn't see Gene Roberts as part of all of this. In fact, he was chastised later, according to him, for even giving Malcolm mouth to mouth. And his supervisor said, why would you even attempt to save this man? And his response to them, according to him, was, I'm a cop. That's my job. What do you want me to do? Let him bleed to death? And of course, they just looked at him. Yeah, that's what we expected you to do. So no, I don't think Roberts was really part of all. Now understand me clearly, and I really don't want this to be busy derby. Do I have contempt for Gene Roberts? Yes. Was Gene Roberts a traitor of our people? Yes. Is he somebody that anybody needs to respect? No. He was an enemy.
Still is.
Right. But as far as this situation with Malcolm X is concerned, I don't think Gene Roberts was part of that assassination thing. Okay? All right, brother. How you doing, brother?
The question that I wanted to ask was one in reference to the secretaries and the baby.
Yeah.
What exactly, unfolded about that? Because I know recently, I think it was this year or either last year, Mr. Farrakhan had address about that. One of the ladies there,
Yeah.
one of the ladies there, and said, these are the girls. What was the whole thing about that?
Okay. Yeah. First off, we need to deal with a couple things. A, we need to deal with the historical reality. B, we then need to deal with the later justification. Okay? Let me deal with the historical reality first. Elijah Muhammad impregnated several young, most of them were in their teens, late teens, who had been secretaries in the Nation of Islam. And in fact, one in particular who was actually on stage at the Savior's Day. Her name in during the early 1960s was a sister by the name of Evelyn Williams, who in fact had been engaged to Malcolm, which by the way was one of those things which when I was talking about 1963 as the schism, part of that, it's hard to measure how much of that, but part of that was that one of the sisters that Malcolm had a relationship with is also going to be one of the sisters that Elijah Muhammad impregnates. Now, he told Malcolm that it was actually 9 sisters, even though he had admitted, in later, terms to 6, okay? But at any rate, these are all young people who were, now, this is what made everything bad. As if it wasn't bad, right? What made everything despicable is that each of these sisters were also excommunicated from the nation, which meant that they were stripped of their membership, shamed in front of their mosque, and chastised, isolated from the community. Now, 2 of these sisters, Lucille and Evelyn, who I just mentioned, Evelyn, they're going to sue Elijah Muhammad in July 1964 for child support, and in a paternity suit. Now, it's interesting. This same Evelyn is going to appear at the Savior's Day celebration on February 21st, 1993, as one of his wives. Well, one of the questions that somebody might want to ask her today is, was she a wife in 1964 when she was suing him? You get my drift? Now, one of the things that's going to happen is this. Once this thing began to circulate, the nation is going to have to explain it. And it's going to go through different levels before it finally reaches where it is. Okay? Today, the argument was simple what? They were his wives. And under Islamic law, you can have, more than one wife. Now, of course, this gets real interesting too, and I do address this in the book, because if we accept that argument, and remember now, this is what muddies the water. He didn't treat them like wives. You don't excommunicate your wife. You understand my point?
You don't isolate them. You don't shame them. But if we follow the logic, then there's still a problem, and this is the problem. If they're talking about traditional Islamic law, okay, it justifies 4. That meant that Elijah could have his wife Claire and then 3 other sisters. The problem is that there were 6 to 9 sisters. You see the problem? So at best, okay, so you can justify 4 of them, but then you still got a problem. Now, of course, if they're basing it on traditional African culture, you know, polygamy there generally did not set a limit. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? But what muddies the water there is that Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam had no appreciation for African culture. You see the problem? Sorry, that's all right. So I'm saying all this to say this. When it first happened, in fact, you can go back to June 1964. Malcolm talked about this, mostly in private though, but what happened was Minister James out of Chicago and Minister Lewis out of Boston, they started teaching in their mosque. You know, they had to somehow explain the baby. So this is what they said. They said that Allah told Elijah to go and spread his seed so that the babies were actually divine. And of course today, that's basically what they're saying today, is that these were legitimate relationships. And by the way, there's a problem with that too. His wife Claire on several occasions threatened to leave him for that very same reason. And of course, you know, if you know anything particularly about African polygamy, you know that the wives, and specifically the senior wife, must give permission. So this ain't something you can just go out and on your own and say, I want this wife. That's not how it works. So, but of course, that's not a problem because the nation don't care about African culture. We know that. But the point is simply that today they justify it. In 1964, 1965, when it was a major issue, they had very little defense. You know, in fact, final point. Malcolm, in early June 1964, he was talking to this brother one time. When they were telling Malcolm, well, you know they're now saying that the babies were divine and that, you know, God told Elijah to spread his seed. And Malcolm said, because see, that's what Malcolm was trying to say. You know what I'm saying? Malcolm was going to justify it similarly. You understand my point? And Malcolm said, imagine that. I got busted down for doing nothing but telling the truth.
Okay, one last thing.
Sure, brother.
In regard to all that you found out about the Nation of Islam and things, in your own personal opinion, do you think that it's something that African Americans and Americans should leave alone or just support quietly, or your opinion about it?
The nation? As an organization, you're saying? Okay. Yeah. I think that the tragedy of the Nation of Islam to me is that after all these years, you know, when they were founded during the 1930s and stuff, they showed early potential. As the 40s, the 50s, and certainly the 60s rolled along, they showed even more potential. And I think that the tragedy of the nation today is that after, 60 years? After 60 years, it still only shows potential, as opposed to actualizing it. You understand my point? My position is that the nation is still a part of us. Okay? So when I speak, I do not necessarily separate myself from the nation because that's a part of me. And when they killed that man, that was a part of me too. Okay? Even though I was young, that's beside the damn point. You know, we're all connected spiritually. Age, all that stuff is distance, the continent to here, all that, irrelevant. We're all Africans. We're all part of the same. But the point is, though, is that I think that the nation needs to be held accountable for their sins, like they try to hold other people accountable for theirs. I think that one of the mistakes that we've made in the past is that we have dealt with the nation with silk gloves, meaning that we've had no problems. For example, today, look at it today. Nobody has any problems, myself included, criticizing the Panthers. Hell, the Panthers made a lot of mistakes. and it's okay for us to critique the Panthers. But when it comes to the nation, who's made a hell of a lot of mistakes too, people are scared. People have a hands-off approach. People say, well, but they're doing this and they're doing that, and maybe we shouldn't, etc. The point is that accountability, is an equal opportunity employer, which means basically that all of us have to be held accountable. The problem with the nation historically has been that they have not been held accountable for their mistakes. And it's not enough, for example, if you study Farrakhan, one of the things that Farrakhan does is, depending on when you catch him, will dictate whether or not they admit that they killed Malcolm or not. You understand what I'm saying? You can go back, for example, to the August 1990 article in Emerge. They caught him on a day in which he said, yeah, I created, we helped to create the atmosphere, yeah, it led to Malcolm's assassination. And then you come back later, for example, he spoke in March 1992, he spoke in Baltimore, Maryland, he said the nation had nothing to do with Malcolm's assassination. Then recently, on Savior's Day, February 21st, 1993, he admitted that they basically killed him. In fact, he did it in a very unique way, to the degree that I don't know to what extent people even realized what he was saying. But he made a statement, and I can quote it for you if you want. But the crux of what he said was, he said, all prophets had a community of zealots. Okay? And when someone attacked that prophet, the community said he must die. He went on to say, Betty Shabazz says we killed her husband. He said, I say no, Betty. It was your husband's teachings that forced him to fight an institution. And it was basically that institution, i.e. Nation of Islam, that brought him to his death. You understand my point? So they go back and forth. And then again, I think a lot of times, depending on the organization that he's speaking to and other factors, will dictate whether or not they're just going to live up to it. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. All right, brother. In fact, one of the things that I'm preparing, we've been preparing for the worst, but one of the things that we figure will ultimately, will be levied against me will probably be that I'm some type of agent or something. So if you hear somewhere in final call or some speech or something that I'm an agent, don't be surprised. Because that's been some of their general tactics that they use so they don't have to deal with real life. Just like they like to say all of the assassins were agents. You've heard that one too. Yeah, they were all agents. And hey, this is the crux of that though. If all the assassins were agents, then that meant Elijah Muhammad had to be an agent too for saying, that those hypocrites need to be blasted off the face of the earth. Elijah Jr. needed to be an agent too for saying, cut out Malcolm's tongue and da-da-da-da-da. Herbert needed to be an agent. In other words, Farrakhan, everybody who made any type of contribution to Malcolm's assassination had to be a damn agent too. Right, yes.
Hotep, thank you for the presentation.
I appreciate it, brother.
The question that I have is despite the attempt on Malcolm's life when he was in Africa, and he reported that he witnessed, he saw when he was a CIA agent, do you think there was a cooperation between the CIA, FBI, NYPD that collectively ultimately led to Malcolm's death? And the other thing is, I'd like you to elaborate on the mechanics of intelligence as far as how they work together to target key people, whether they be in the business area like Reginald Lewis or like an Arthur Ashe. Despite the fact that he was a sports figure, he was very actively involved in South Africa, and he gets the bad blood, being the type of person he is. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Let me deal with your first question first. There is a bylaw inside the intelligence community of the United States government that was, I think, was passed in the 1950s, which basically says that intelligence apparatus must communicate with each other, must share information with each other. For example, if you go into the Bureau and you begin to probe files, one of the things that you're going to find numerous FBI documents that were carbon copied to the counterintelligence units of Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, Air Force intelligence, Marine intelligence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, CIA intelligence, National Security Agents intelligence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was part of the law, so that they can exchange information in order to what? To better create an intelligence apparatus. Clearly, there was quite a bit of interaction between the various intelligence agencies in Malcolm's assassination. Now, one of the points, though, that I want to be very clear that I made on Gil's show is that the CIA and the FBI historically have had a very strained relationship, even though it hasn't stopped them, however, from covering each other's back and what have you. But the truth of the matter is that they've always had a competitive relationship. Hoover always despised the CIA, and the CIA, in turn, always kept their distance from Hoover. Clearly, however, there was much interaction between them, and not only that, we need to be very clear on something. As a general rule, they have to cover each other's back. I'll give you an excellent case in point. CIA, was involved in the, Fidel Castro assassination plot. And one of the things that happened was, the CIA, went to the mafia, and the mafia, and they basically bargained with the mafia. They said, we'll make a deal with you. They said, look, Castro threw y'all out, and y'all pissed off at Castro. True or false? True. Okay. Now, here's the deal. You help us to ice Castro, and we, in turn, will turn over the drug trafficking to you in the Cuba-Miami connection, and we will allow you to bring in prostitution, vice, and all those other goodies that you had before Castro took over. And so mafia leaders met, and they said, a bet. Now what's going to happen is, in line with all of that, something is going to take place. There was a former FBI agent by the name of Robert Mahon. And one of the things that he is going to do is, there's actually two stories to explain why it happened, and I don't feel like going into detail. But what's going to happen is, a bug is going to be placed on the hotel room of Sam Giancana. He was one of the mafia, lords in all of this. And what's going to happen is, the CIA is going to put this bug on. Now, this was illegal, however. And it was Mahon, working for the CIA that's going to be responsible for this bug. At any rate, the Bureau is going to find it. And see, that's supposed to lead to criminal charges. And ultimately, what's going to happen is the Bureau is going to basically forget it. The Justice Department, under Robert Kennedy, is going to drop it. And the reason being is they found out that it was part of the whole assassination plot of Castro, and it might lead to embarrassment of the United States government. So I'm saying all that to say that they will cover each other's back even when they have bad times, bad blood between themselves. Now, final point that we need to make note of, and that is BOSS, the Bureau of Special Services and Investigation, the FBI especially, they were constantly exchanging information about Malcolm. And in fact, one of the reasons, for example, that the FBI did not have a bug on the headquarters of Malcolm's organizations in the, Hotel Teresa, one of the reasons that the FBI didn't have to bug it was because the Bureau of Special Services and Investigation had bugged it, and they were constantly giving them the information, so there was no need for them to bug it. Now, as far as your second question, and by the way, I go more in depth in the book as well, as far as, that collaboration. Now, as far as your second question is concerned, one of the things that we always need to be, cognizant of is that the enemy sees the world from a lot different, from a whole different angle than we. And even if we, for example, can look at somebody and say, he supports the system. He ain't threatening the damn system. Unlike that brother, that sister. So they must love this person. One of my mentors when I was an undergrad once told me something. She said, remember Zach, she said, what we see and what the enemy see sometimes can be as different as night and day. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that somebody who we might view as soft, somebody that we might view as somebody who's supporting the system, who's their best friend and stuff, the enemy might have a whole different view. So I'm saying all that to say that we would be very foolish to underestimate. And in fact, I think as a general rule, every African person, as a general rule, when any one of us, whether they're moderates or so-called radicals, or whatever the hell the system wants to call them and stuff, dies of anything, we need to be suspicious. End of the story. And we need to have some people who's going to just basically look into it. Because see, what generally happens is we do that only when somebody gets offed. Then we want to investigate, even though in many ways we don't do that either. Hell, that's why Malcolm's assassination went unabetted. But when somebody dies just in general who's made any type of contribution to struggle, questions need to be asked. End of the story. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, we appreciate that. What's that? Oh, yeah, right. Does he still got time?
No, he has to go home. He has to go home.
Okay, about what time is it?
Time for you to go. Time to get you over here.
I mean, specifically, what time is it? 9 o'clock. It's 9 o'clock?
Yeah.
Okay, now, we're only, what, about 10, 15 minutes from where you go?
You gotta get you.
Okay, because...
You should know better.
Yeah, you
gotta watch him.
Yeah, okay.
He continued.
Okay, but just one point then. What he was asking me before the question and answer, he wanted me to read, in the back of the book, I came up with lessons that we can learn from Malcolm's assassination, and he just wanted me to just, say something about those lessons. And in fact, I don't mind, I can be reading it while I'm walking out the door. I don't mind, it's all right by me.
You want to read it now? If you really get the time, before he tries to put it
The brother will be back. If anyone needs a ride uptown, the Bronx, there's a brother here who's going back. Anybody going to the Bronx? Uptown? Okay.
Okay, well.
Not the Bronx, that's the Bronx.
The D train to the Bronx.
The Bronx.
Okay, I'm ready to go. Let's go. Okay. This is the lessons of Malcolm's murders.
One willing to listen. Be quiet, please.
Okay, Africans must go to extraordinary lengths to protect and defend our leaders and must never rely on outside forces to secure them. 2, our leaders must settle family problems and personal differences in private and in a reasonable and appropriate manner. 3, we must hold our leaders accountable for their actions and never place them above criticism and scrutiny. 4, we must accent our similarities and positives over differences and negatives. 5, we must tighten internal security and develop infrastructures and organizations that prevent infiltration and other disruptions. 6, although the masses have a right to know about contradictions and character weaknesses of our leaders, care must be taken to ensure that the problems are presented in a constructive manner so that correctives can be encouraged and employed. 7, we must place more emphasis on our leaders' teachings, actions, and examples rather than their personalities. 8, we must always leave communication lines open. 9, we must be conscious of the enemy's never-ending campaign to destroy and neutralize forces working to liberate and empower us, and must never underestimate the intensity and magnitude of this campaign. 10, we must always demand that our leaders resolve internal problems without damaging or confusing the larger community or struggle. 11, we must always demand truth from our leaders and never forget that this is a right rather than a privilege. 12, we must not transform mortals into immortals. I'm tired. Okay, Bob.
That's what it is.
And I think that's mine.
Yeah. Okay. Have a seat. Get yourself.
All right. Laura?
Alzira Art Center last night.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Powerful, brother. Super powerful.
I appreciate that, brother.
Yes, indeed, that was super powerful. We're gonna make
Anybody for the Bronx? Anybody uptown?